For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and you're watching The Gist. Welcoming from Kabul, Yawar Adili. He's the country director and researcher with a very famous organization in Afghanistan that is doing some extremely insightful and in-depth work over many decades, the Afghanistan Analysts Network. Ali Saab, salam, and thank you so much for giving your time.
Salam to you and to your viewers, and thank you for having me.
Ali Saab, just looking at developments that are taking place so fast now. I mean, with the Taliban making those rapid advances, in the north, in the northeast, even in Badakhan, in Badghis, Kandahar, of course, overnight there have been developments. Iran border, Tajikistan border, Turkmenistan border, Pakistan. What's the reason for that, especially their quick movements in areas which are usually thought to be opposition dominated?
Well, thank you. There are several reasons for the Taliban's quick and swift territorial gains across the country, especially in the north. One, the security forces used to have air support provided by the U.S. forces. And second, the security forces used to have logistical support provided by U.S. contractors. And those supports are no longer available to the security forces. And the third reason is that the U.S. Taliban deal, which was signed on 29 February 2020, and also President Biden's announcement of full and unconditional withdrawal on 14 April, boosted the morale of the Taliban fighters and undermined the morale of the security forces across the country. So these are some of the reasons for the Taliban's recent and quick territorial gains across the country.
Right. I mean, these are pictures we're seeing of Taliban propaganda in terms of their training camps that they released. We also have a very short video of celebrations in Quetta, right in the middle of the city, after a border crossing with Pakistan was reportedly taken over. But since you mentioned it, what is the morale of the NDSF, the Afghan National Defense Security Forces? I mean, we're hearing now from first Vice President Amrullah Saleh that there were some forces who were trying to surrender to the Taliban and were trying to cross over into Pakistan who have been arrested. What's the morale like of the Afghan forces?
Well, the morale of the security forces somehow declined right after the U.S. Taliban deal was signed in Doha on 29 February 2020. As Afghanistan Analysts Network reported extensively, this morale dropped significantly across the country after that deal. And then after President Biden's announcement of unconditional withdrawal, it further dropped and declined in the country. And of course, we have seen the news that the security forces have either surrendered to the Taliban in different districts, or they had to flee the country, for example, in the north to Central Asian countries, or now, for example, the news that the security forces also flee into Pakistan, or tried to flee into Pakistan from Spin Boldak of Kandahar province. And yesterday, for example, I was just going back home from office, and security forces in Kabul city at one checkpoint. I had my phone in my hand, reading news. They were asking me what was happening, and I asked them what was happening and what did they know about what was happening across the country. One of them responded that, well, our morale is so low nowadays.
That's extremely unfortunate. But tell us a little bit more about the other developments, which is, the erstwhile Northern Alliance leaders who have been power brokers in power for so long, even after 2001, talking about local or popular mobilization forces, which is basically local militias. It's been called a second resistance to the Taliban, whether it's Atta Mohammad Noor in Balk in the north, whether it's Ismail Khan in the west, in Herat, or even Mohakik or in the Hazara areas. How can they help the Afghan defense forces in combating the Taliban, or is there a danger that again Afghanistan might, go into a lot of infighting or a civil war among these groups?
Well, before responding to your question, I should also highlight that the security forces, and of course there was some poor management on the part of the leadership of the security forces across the country when they decided to abandon certain outposts and also remote areas and withdraw from those outposts in areas in order to gather their forces at the strategic points in more important districts. But I think the withdrawal from those districts and outposts was somehow interpreted as a defeat, and it also contributed to the domino effect of the fall of security, the districts to the Taliban. And regarding your question about the mobilization by power brokers in different provinces, especially in the north and also central highlands of Afghanistan, I have observed like 3 periods for this mobilization. One is after the U.S. Taliban agreement was signed, certain figures and factions started speaking of a second resistance. And of course, they thought that the U.S. Taliban agreement gave too much concessions to the Taliban, which actually it did. And then they thought that this, given that the Taliban had secured now too much concession, they might not engage in serious negotiations with the Islamic Republic or with the government and other political forces. Therefore, these political factions and political leaders or power brokers started speaking of a second resistance. And of course, they call it second resistance because they also fought against the Taliban in 1990s until late 2001, and they call that period as the first resistance, and now they are speaking of the second resistance. And then the second period of this mobilization is started after the withdrawal, after the President Biden's announcement of unconditional withdrawal on 14 April, and then we saw like armed maneuvers by these power brokers and leaders across provinces, especially in the north, and they thought that this unconditional withdrawal gave further incentive to the Taliban to push for a military takeover, and then they started this public, for the first time, public armed maneuvers. Of
Sure.
course, there could be different motives behind that. One is that they wanted to be part of the war in peace with the Taliban, and the second is that there were some expectations from their constituencies or their communities of them to offer or to provide some protection against the Taliban, and therefore they started this armed
Sure.
mobilization.
The question is whether they are actually helping consolidate the resistance against the Taliban or whether it's fragmenting. But everyone knows, Ali Saab, that the root of the problem is across the Durand line in Pakistan. Now, how do you see Pakistan playing its policy currently? Does it realize that if it gives again momentum to groups like this, they will be hit themselves within Pakistan by terrorism as well? We've seen that already.
There are two aspects of this resistance. One is, of course, this resistance so far relies on the government, on the support by the government. And of course, the government is still trying to deal with this mass mobilization in different provinces. Initially, some of the government officials, including the acting Minister of Interior, Bismillah Khan Mohammadi, called on all people in whichever geography, in whichever area they were, to mobilize against the Taliban and arm themselves, and that the government would provide military equipment and other support to these groups. And also a Deputy Minister of Interior, Dr. Fayek, also traveled to Balkh and some other provinces in the north and called on the people to mobilize against the Taliban and promised that the government would provide support. But later on, President Ghani, in one government, in a cabinet meeting, told people to join one of the security forces, one of the security institutions, instead of, for example, arming themselves independently. Therefore, the government is somehow struggling to respond to this mass mobilization. And the second point is, of course, that is still, the mobilization is still going on in different provinces, and the people are also somehow weighing whether, for example, fighting, if they start fighting, there would be some support for them as well, or not.
Alisa, I'm just going to, the US and its exit from Afghanistan playing a major role and a lot of criticism of President Biden. But I just want to play out a soundbite of the Pentagon spokesperson, Kirby, when he was asked about how they were dealing with this quick and rapid movement of the Taliban.
To provide support to the Afghan forces when feasible. And I'm not going to speak with great specificity about what that's going to look like, or in what scenarios we might be able to deliver it and what scenarios we won't. But they have the advantages. They have better capabilities than the Taliban. in the air and on the ground. And they are certainly going to continue to have American support financially, logistically, and through assistance and maintenance. And it really is going to come down to an internal leadership decision there, politically and militarily, to take advantage of those gains and those benefits that they have. But I'm not going to get into a specific back and forth of what's going on the ground.
Amitabh, he's basically saying that militarily the Afghan forces are stronger. We could have another discussion on that. But the point that he's trying to make is about unity, about how Kabul, the politicians need to be united. We're seeing both President Ghani and the High Council for National Reconciliation chairperson Abdullah, who were called to meet President Biden, for example. That was at least a photo op of unity. But do Afghanistan's politicians understand the danger and how they need to be united to fight the Taliban, or at least negotiate with the Taliban if that happens on the table?
Well, unfortunately, the disunity among the political elites and political leaders in Kabul has had dire impact on the morale of the security forces as well. Of course, even before the start of Taliban's military march across the districts, we saw, for example, a prolonged political stalemate in Faryab, and this was the dispute over the appointment of the governor. And of course, President Ghani somehow unilaterally appointed a new governor for the province, and then
set him on a flight, and Mohakik had problems with that. The flight was called back. Yeah, a perfect example of disunity.
Yeah, and then of course, Jumbish Milli, the party that is led by Marshal Dostum, disputed that appointment, and then there were protests across the country, while the leadership at both the national level and the provincial level had to be planning for any Taliban incursion into the districts and provinces, but they were like in a sort of political logjam over an appointment. So that is like a case in point in terms of their disunity and how it could affect the planning and also the kind of mobilization against the Taliban.
I just wanted to ask you, Amitabh, also about what do you think about India's role? I mean, there's a lot of activity happening in Central Asia, whether first it was Dushanbe, now and then in Tashkent, the SEO contact group met. Khalilzad is also in the area. They're looking for bases or other cooperation with Central Asia. India has constantly said that the only way is through negotiation, but you see that actually happening. I mean, there is reports of a group of Afghan leaders who will be traveling possibly over the weekend to Doha to talk to the Taliban.
Well, so far there has been like growing calls from different quarters of Afghan society for India to play a more active role. But so far, I think India is trying to somehow, for example, trying to maintain its own interest in Afghanistan. And of course, India has had a lot of investment in infrastructural projects and development projects across Afghanistan, and now there is like a sort of fear that those projects and those developments could be threatened, or if there is, for example, a military takeover of the Taliban. But I think India can play a role in terms of helping a sort of regional consensus, building regional consensus for a political settlement between the government and the Taliban, because I think that is uh, the the right path to ending the current conflict across Afghanistan. And given that India's relations with different countries in the region and its leverage with different countries in the region, it can and also India's relations with the U.S., it can somehow use those leverages and those relationships to contribute to building a sort of regional consensus, and that the solution to Afghan conflict will not be any military takeover or, for example, an imposition of a forced government, but there should be a political settlement eventually. Even if there is a military takeover, there will still need to be like a political settlement to the conflict.
With the Taliban being controlled, or at least by Rawalpindi, by GHQ, by Pakistan deep state, do you think the Taliban has any reason to talk to India? Does India have any leverage with the Taliban?
Well, there have been reports of India reaching out to the Taliban, and of course, India also somehow denied, or the government institutions and officials have somehow denied those reports. Yeah, and of course they have also somehow there are reports in India media, as we read and see, calling on India to reach out to the Taliban, but this is mainly for maintaining their interest in Afghanistan. But I think perhaps every country is trying to maintain their own interest in Afghanistan, but I think there should be like a role beyond just maintaining their interest in Afghanistan. And India can still reach out to other regional countries and neighboring countries for a sort of regional consensus on the way forward in Afghanistan.
Yawar Adili, thank you so much for your insight and experiences in Afghanistan as we continue to monitor developments there very closely. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
A pleasure. A reminder to our viewers to subscribe to our YouTube channel, to click on the bell icon as well. You'll get notified when we put up videos like this one. To help us, you can support us financially. Just click on the link that's given in the YouTube descriptor and follow us on our social media handles on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. This is The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh.